So I'll pass it to John Tovey to start us off with a karakia.
Tēnā koutou e homa. Nau mai whakatau mai ki tēnei te hui tuatahi o te rōpū tiara whakaraura. I've chosen I'm based in Kapiti here. I'm going to use a karakia from Te Rauparaha. It's a section of a song. Ka oho te wairua, ka matara te tinana. E aroha ki te aroha, ka kā te rama. And it translates as, when the spirit is awakened and the body is alert, when love is unconditional, enlightenment follows. So I hope you enjoy our time together. Nō reira. Kia ora koutou. Kia koe tō.
Kia ora. Thanks, John. Okay, my name's Torfrida Wainwright. I'm part of a group within Extinction Rebellion called Pathway to Survival. We've been looking at the big transformational changes that we're going to need if we're to meet the climate crisis, the ecosystem collapse, the huge gaps between in wealth inequality and the festering injustice of our colonial legacy as we go into the future. So we set up these webinars to look at these transformational changes. At this point, I'd also like to mihi to the mana whenua of this whole motu, and recognise that there can be no climate justice without tiriti justice. These crises are interlocking and the solutions are interlocking as well. Now, there are a lot of people who are working on these transformational changes, and in the webinar series that we've started up, we want to bring them together to look at the nature of those changes and what people are suggesting and proposals. This particular webinar brings together two of them, both looking at how climate justice can't be separated from social justice. Firstly, we got Jason Hickel in a short video clip on how we can and must reduce our consumption and energy use and why degrowth will save the world. That's just a little video clip from him. Then we'll have John Minto in a longer and live presentation on how we can and must end inequality through major taxation reforms and wealth redistribution. That'll be followed by questions to John and some discussion. So we're going to invite you to ask questions or make comments in the chat, and that will be, and John will see those and can answer them. Now this webinar is being recorded, and we're going to put it on our website and Facebook page afterwards. But we're doing it so that there's no view of participants, just for privacy reasons. We've scheduled to go to 9 o'clock, but we can end the recording at 8. We'll end the recording at 8:30, and we'll continue discussion after that if people would like to do so. So first up, we've got Jason Hickel. He's born in Africa. He grew up in America, and he's now working in UK and Europe. He's an ecological economist and anthropologist. His major books include The Divide, Global Inequality and Its Solutions, and Less is More, or How Degrowth Will Save the World. So those are his key interests. So let's watch.
No sound.
My bad. Practice it thousands of times and forget to do that bit.
A reality that most of you probably follow in the news, or maybe you know it on a visceral level, for you see it happening around you in real time. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan made landfall in the Philippines. It was the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded on our planet, with wind speeds of up to 200 miles per hour. Not even the most calloused observers were left unmoved by the images that circulated around the world that month. It was destruction on a vast scale. Whole cities and towns were laid waste. 6 million people were displaced and thousands disappeared. 2 years later, bodies were still being retrieved from the wreckage. As this was happening, the UN Climate Change Conference was being held in Poland at exactly the same time. The delegate from the Philippines, a soft-spoken man by the name of Yeb Sano, gave an emotional speech that went viral on social media. Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall in my family's hometown, and the devastation is staggering, he said. I struggle to find words for the images that we see. I struggle to find words to describe the losses we have suffered from this cataclysm. Up to this hour, I agonize while waiting for word as to the fate of my very own family. We must stop calling events like these natural disasters, he said. It's the result of inequality and the pursuit of so-called economic growth that dominates our world. In a voice choked by tears but bolstered by rage, he continued, what my country is going through is a result of this extreme climate event is madness. The climate crisis is madness. I speak for my delegation, but more than that, I speak for the countless people who will no longer be able to speak for themselves, having perished in this storm. And it's not just superstorms. It's not just the Philippines. Draw to mind the images that you've seen over the past few years. Right? Think of the fires that blazed through Australia recently, where people took refuge on beaches as their world went up in flames. Think of the eerie dark orange that smeared the skies of the US West Coast this last summer as fires scorched parched earth from California to Washington. Our planet is changing before our very eyes, and we are already grieving. Right now, we're only at 1 degree above normal temperatures. On our present trajectory, we're on track to hit 3 or 4 degrees this century. Humans have never existed on a planet that's like that before. And climate scientists say that such a world is incompatible with organized civilization as we know it. Without radical action, at least 1 billion people will be displaced in our lifetime as parts of the planet become uninhabitable. Average yields of staple food crops will collapse by up to 30%, triggering famines in many parts of the world. It doesn't take much to grasp that this is likely to cause unprecedented social and political upheaval. But climate change is not the only ecological problem we face. The crisis is much broader than this. There's deforestation to the point where many forest ecosystems like the Amazon are on the verge of collapse. There's soil depletion, whereby industrial monoculture is destroying topsoils faster than they can be replenished. There's biodiversity loss, with rates of species extinction happening up to 1,000 times faster than prior to the Industrial Revolution. On our present trajectory, 30 to 50% of existing species are projected to disappear by the end of this century. Our non-human relatives are being systematically exterminated. So what's causing all of this? Well, we often refer to this as the Anthropocene, right? An era where human impact is fundamentally reshaping our planet. But this leads us to believe that humans are the problem. But the language of the Anthropocene has it totally wrong. It's not humans as such that are causing this crisis. Rather, it's our economic system, namely capitalism. Now, let me clarify what I mean by capitalism here, because there can be misunderstandings. Normally, when people think about capitalism, they associate it with markets, trade, businesses, and so on. But this isn't exactly accurate. Capitalism is a system that's only about 500 years old. Markets, trade, and even businesses existed for thousands of years before this, and they are innocent enough on their own. What makes capitalism distinctive is that it's organized around and dependent on perpetual growth. It's the first and only economic system in human history that is intrinsically expansionary. If it doesn't grow, it collapses into crisis, triggering recessions. People lose their jobs, poverty goes up, inequality rises, and so on. So we have to keep the gross domestic product, the GDP, growing at a rate of 3% per year. Now, this might seem like a small increments because we're used to thinking of growth in linear terms. But remember, this is a compounding exponential function. And during the COVID pandemic, we've all learned how dangerous exponential functions can become. Now, this might not be a problem if GDP was just plucked out of thin air, but it's not. It requires resources and energy. So the more the economy grows, the more resource and energy it chews up. And this is what's driving ecological breakdown. Yeb Sano was right. So I want to show you just a couple of slides here to illustrate a few key points, if I can. So this is a graph that shows you two lines. One is global resource use in black there, and the other line is global GDP. Okay. Now what this demonstrates is a very tight coupling between GDP growth and resource use. There was talk a couple of decades ago about the possibility of green growth, whereby GDP would keep going up while resource use fell, but that hasn't happened. In fact, resource use has been rising at a faster pace than GDP. And this gives you a sense for kind of where we're at globally right now. The red line you see is what scientists consider to be the safe, sustainable boundary for resource use. And as you can see, we blew past that boundary in the 1990s, and things have only accelerated since then. This is what is driving the ecological breakdown that we're seeing all around us. Okay. Now, crucially, not all nations are equally responsible for this crisis. Here we have the per capita sustainable threshold in red here, and low income countries over here and lower middle income countries right here consume very little, actually, only about 2 to 3 tons of stuff per person. Whereas high income nations over here consume vastly in excess of the sustainable boundary, about 28 tons of material stuff per person per year. High income nations are almost the sole drivers of the ecological breakdown that our planet is experiencing, even though most of it harms the global south, the poor countries of the global south most. Something is true also of climate change. This graph shows you who has contributed most to excess emissions over the past couple hundred years. And what we see is that the USA is single-handedly responsible for 40% of the emissions that are causing climate breakdown, the EU for 29%, the global north as a group for 92%, and all of the regions of the global south, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, are responsible for only 8% of those emissions. And yet, the consequences of climate breakdown affect the global south most brutally. So what we're dealing with here is also a crisis that has clear colonial dimensions that we need to pay attention to. So how do we resolve this? What do we do? Well, we know what has to happen. Global emissions have to fall by 50% in the next 10 years and reach zero by the middle of the century in order for us to stay under 1.5 degrees. Crucially, because high-income nations have contributed the vast majority of historical emissions, they have to do it much faster, reaching zero by 2030, right at the latest, in order to be just about that. Okay, just give me a second to go back here. So the question is it possible for us to do this? Is it possible for us to transition to 100% renewable energy and reverse ecological breakdown in the short time that we have left? Fortunately, the answer is yes, but not if we continue to pursue economic growth at the usual rates. In fact, we need a completely different approach. High-income nations, as we've seen, need to significantly reduce their use of resources and energy. So this is what we refer to as degrowth. And it's an idea that's been gaining a lot of steam among scientists and social movements in the past few years. Degrowth is a planned reduction of resource and energy use in high-income nations designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. And the core claim of degrowth is that high-income nations don't need more growth to deliver flourishing lives and high levels of well-being for all. So what does this look like in reality? Well, the dominant assumption in economics right now is that all sectors of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether we actually need them. But this is a socially and ecologically irrational way to run an economy. Instead, we should have an open conversation about what parts of the economy we actually want to expand, things like public healthcare, renewable energy, public transportation, and so on, and what parts are clearly destructive and need to be scaled down, things like the arms industry, SUVs, private jets, fast fashion, industrial beef, advertising, and so on. Of course, the reason we don't do this is because of the specter of unemployment. If we scale down, if we take the rational step of scaling down less necessary parts of the economy, there will be fewer jobs. And obviously we need jobs in order to survive in our economic system. In fact, the main reason we all line up behind the growth agenda is because we always need more jobs. But this is not the only solution. An alternative approach is to shorten the working week and distribute necessary labor more evenly. We don't need more jobs, we need a better distribution of work. And the exciting thing is that shortening the working week has been shown to have significant positive impact on people's health, happiness, and well-being. We also need to significantly reduce inequality. We're often told that we need growth to create more income and improve people's lives. But in rich countries like Britain, the problem isn't that there's a deficit of income. The problem is that it's all captured at the top. The key thing to grasp here is that we can solve our social problems right now simply by sharing what we already have more fairly, rather than plundering the earth for more. At the same time, we need to expand universal public services, not just healthcare and education, but transportation, affordable housing, energy, and internet, so that everyone can have access to the resources they need to live good lives without requiring high levels of private income in order to do so. So the exciting thing is that it's 100% possible for us to do this, to scale down excess resource use, take pressure off of the global south, reverse ecological damage, while at the same time building a flourishing society, one that is more just and more caring. But it requires breaking free from the shackles of growthism. And that is difficult to do, because for decades we've been taught that growth is the only way. It's so deeply embedded in our ideology that we rarely think to question it. But question it we must. And when we do, exciting new possibilities open up. So in this book, Less is More, my goal is to take readers on a journey, telling the story of how we came to see the world as we do today, and what a different way of being might look like. Thanks very much.
Sorry.
Okay, is it okay? Shall I? Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Shall we go on to, we'll go on, you can tell this is our first webinar. It's going to get better. It's going to get much more slick than this. So that was Jason Hickel, who's frames the overall issue, I think, really well. And next we have John Minto, who looks in more specifics at how we can do wealth distribution.
Amounts of production and consumption.
Sorry,
and if you don't get economic growth every year at about.
Sorry, I had too much noise.
Okay, shall I go again?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So next up, we've got John Minto. He needs a little introduction to everybody. He's been fighting for social and global justice for decades now, from the Hickel Racist Tours heart in 1980 to Palestine Solidarity Network Aotearoa today, and lots in between. So without further ado, let's pass to John. Thanks, John.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much for the invitation to present here and to take part in this discussion, which is obviously a really important one. And the only thing I'll say at the start is that big changes in the history of humanity have always started with small groups of people. And that's in fact the only way change ever happens. It always starts from small groups of people. So I think we've got now a huge concern globally, and enough people, I think, to take the sort of action that can disrupt the status quo, if you understand what I mean, so that we can get on a track, which is a much better one for ourselves and the planet. So what I'm going to do. I'm involved in this little group here in Christchurch called EQ Action, which is ecumenical action. So it's a group of Christians, and I'm not a Christian, but they invited me to come in and do a presentation on GST at one point. And from there, developed working with them, we've developed a proposal for changing our tax system to make it much fairer. So I'm just going to run through some slides from that tax proposal, which is one aspect of what Jason Hickel was talking about. And then, yeah, a discussion and questions would be great. So I'll just share the screen here. This one. And so is everybody, can everybody see that okay? Everybody's quiet. I presume that's all good. Okay. Look, this first slide is just one. You'll recognise from the figures there that it's about 5 years old, but it tells a story of how unfair our tax system is. So if you're a worker on the minimum wage, you pay income tax and you pay GST, and so this person, on the minimum wage doing 40 hours a week pays 28.6% of their income in tax. But if you take a rich lister, someone who's who would appear in the NBR's rich list each year, they effectively pay less than 5% of what they earn, of the extra earnings in tax each year. So we've got a very, very unfair system, and one which puts the tax burden, if you like, although it's not good to call tax a burden, because tax actually is something positive. It's something that's working, putting money into keeping our community working well. And I think anyway, that's I guess a starting point for EQ Action in what we were trying to do. So here is something that people aren't aware of generally. This is a graph. Sorry, you can't see that head of the graph there, but this is a reflection of the impact that GST has on people's income. So the amount of tax people pay. So if you take pretty much any of those lines, you can take the blue line, the percentage of your total income that you pay in GST. Now, along the bottom there, the 1 to 10, those are deciles. So decile 1 on the left-hand side is the are people in the poorest incomes, the poorest 10% of households. At the number 10 end is the wealthiest 10%. So if you go back to look at the poorest 10%, you find that people in the poorest 10% are paying around 14% of their total income in GST, right? But go down the other end, people who are getting into very high tax, very high wealth areas. You've got people there paying less than 5% of their income, of their total income in GST. So you see there's a GST when it was introduced. I remember Phil Goff saying, "Oh, well, we need this tax because the wealthy don't pay much tax, and at least they'll have to pay GST." And it just seemed to me that was the wrong way around. And I think the wrong way of looking at it. And the burden of GST has been huge on low income people. So the problem, here's the Sheriff of Nottingham. That's the best graphic I could find online with the Sheriff of Nottingham in it. So we've got a Sheriff of Nottingham policy: take from the poor and give to the rich. And our income tax system is heavily weighted against those on low incomes. And wage and salary earners are the people who pay the highest rates of tax, because we pay tax on every dollar we earn and every dollar we spend. And then I've already mentioned GST there, the effect that GST has. And essentially, the more wealth you have, the lower the tax rates you pay. And that is something which I think is it's morally wrong, and it's unsustainable. And if we're going to move forward, we need to change it. So these people are not Robin Hood. Both National and Labor are following the same economic prescription for tax generally. What they both say is that, and they've said this for 30 or 40 years, is that one of the benefits of New Zealand taxation system, is that it is a low rates of tax that are very broadly based. That's how they sell it. They say low rates, broad based. But when you have a system like that, you have the heaviest burden goes on people on the lowest incomes. So I think that's the actual problem. We've got to move away from that model, and we've got to start targeting tax where we have higher rates of tax on income, which is at the moment unearned income, which people pay no tax on at all. So the problem, so wage and salary earners can't avoid tax. The wealthy and super wealthy easily avoid tax. For them, tax is largely voluntary. The wealthiest 5% now own 37% of our wealth, and their share is growing at the expense of the rest of us. And tax policy is a key reason for this growing inequality. So moving on to the solutions. So this was the group EQ Action. This is what we came up with solutions, in terms of solution. We're saying remove GST completely. If you remove GST completely, you're putting a very large amount of money back in the pockets of people on the lowest of incomes, right? So those people that are currently paying 14% of their income in GST would have, in a sense, a 14% increase in their disposable income. And if we're going to get rid of GST, we have to find $25 billion somewhere else. And we are proposing 3 taxes to do that. So a financial transactions tax to bring in a minimum of $15 billion per year. Now, it's very difficult to work out the exact amount of financial transactions tax could bring in. In theory, it could bring in far more than that. It could bring in $60 billion a year. But when you introduce a tax, as we are proposing, then the wealthy and businesses, they find ways to work around it to the extent they can. But we think $15 billion with a good FTT and tight government regulation is absolutely doable. A wealth tax bringing in about $10 or $11 billion per year, and a capital acquisitions tax, which would bring in approximately $2 billion per year. So just going through those a little bit more detail. So this would be a small percentage tax. This is the financial transactions tax. A small percentage tax will be applied to all financial transactions that go through our banks and financial institutions here in New Zealand. So for the average person, this would amount to about $2 per week. So you pay about $1 on the income going into your account, and you'd pay about the same amount on the money going out of your account each week. So maybe $2 a week. But it would bring in around, as I said before, around $15 billion for the government annually. New Zealand has the 10th most traded tax in the world, the 10th most traded currency in the world. And there are trillions of dollars that go through the New Zealand banks every year, and our financial institutions, and that could bring in a massive amount of money at just 0.1% going in and out. Now, a lot of that speculation in the New Zealand dollar would shift to other currencies if a financial transactions tax came in, because it would mean some of these transactions. It's just pure speculation. And if there is a tax here, that speculation will move to other places. But all money coming in and out of New Zealand, in and out of our banks, would attract this tax. And as I've said before, we think $15 billion would be easy to raise through that tax. We don't have the resources to be able to, to be able to calculate that more accurately, because there are a lot of factors which would have to come into it. But we have a lot of people, and we have a whole army of people at Treasury who would be able to do these calculations much more accurately, or more accurately than we're able to do. So implications of an FTT. I think for a $1 million house, if you're buying a $1 million house, you'd have an FTT of about $1,000, But again, that's very small in relation to even the real estate fees that you might pay if you were selling your house. It would be the time when somebody would pay the most in a financial transactions tax. Most people would pay on a financial transactions tax. KiwiSavers would attract FTT, but again, the cost, if that 0.1% on every dollar going in and out of your KiwiSaver account, that means it's a very small amount compared to the actual fees which you're paying. So here's a wealth tax. Now, wealth taxes, this is a very conservative wealth tax. I think the numbers could be ramped up radically, but with our proposal, we didn't want to scare people. We wanted to say that this is easily doable. We can bring in at least $11 billion this way, and it would mean people would pay tax based on the wealth they have, right? And most people who've accumulated a lot of wealth have not paid very much tax over the last 30 years, really, since the 1980s, because we've So what we're saying is that that very small amounts of tax on the wealth that's been earned over the last, for most people over the last 30 or 40 years is quite reasonable. So it would simply be people filling out a tax return each year, up to the first $1 million, 0%. If you've got a $1.5 million house, for example, you pay a very small amount each year on that. And if we do have people who live who are on very small incomes, who live in mortgage-free houses, and they would face, some of them would face a significant wealth tax each year. But just as people now can defer paying their rates until their house is eventually sold, the same thing could happen to a wealth tax. So it doesn't have to be an imposition on people in that situation, which is what usually comes up. Where else are there wealth taxes? Well, I've just put a few there. There's lots of them around the world. Colombia, France, Norway, Spain, Switzerland are some of them. And as I say, this is not a radical proposal. This is really I think a very basic tax to consider for the situation we're in. And here's how much it would bring in. This is the calculations we've done based on the Statistics Department figures on wealth distribution in New Zealand. So most of the population would pay nothing. So most people would pay 0% each year. And then it goes down 191,000, 84, 22, and 4,900 in those different tax brackets, and the total of 10.9 billion. Capital acquisitions tax. This is a little bit similar to what we used to have, a death duties tax back up until the 1990s when National got rid of it. But instead of paying it on the estate, this is paid on the capital that a person gains from any capital acquisition, but for the most part, it would be if you receive a significant amount of money from an inheritance, or somebody trying to avoid an inheritance tax by giving you a gift. So it would cover any capital acquisition that you receive. And again, you could get up to $1 million in an inheritance without paying any tax on it. But once it goes over $50 million, if you're receiving that money, we're saying a 60% tax would be quite reasonable. And here we have countries which have capital acquisitions taxes already. Japan has the highest at 55%, right down to Italy at 4%. So what I'm saying again is that none of these, this is not a radical proposal. These are proposals which are already in place in some parts of the world. And pretty much finally, this is if the rich paid the same tax rate as minimum wage workers. So, I said before, these minimum wage workers paying about 28% of their income on GST. If the super wealthy paid 28% of their earnings each year in tax, like the minimum wage workers, then we would have a huge amount of income being able to provide the healthcare and the education that Jason Hickel was talking about, things we need to invest in, and of course, warm, dry homes for everybody and a whole lot more besides. So that's our, I'll just stop screen sharing there. But that's our proposal on tax. I'm just going to leave it there, and if people have got questions and comments, please feel free to feel free to go to chip in.
Yes, if you'd like to, if you've got questions, comments, could you add them to the chat? And that'll be a good way of, and then John can see them and we can pick them up from there.
Yep. Nothing in the chat yet. That's just like the wealthy paying the tax. They're not paying very much yet, but yeah. I mean, even people, the super wealthy around the world. Well, Warren Buffett said once, he said that my secretary pays a higher percentage of her income in tax than I do. And because being super wealthy, he had all sorts of ways of avoiding tax and paid only a very minuscule amount, whereas the secretary was paying maybe 25, 30% tax. Yeah. Looks bloody good to me. Where do I sign up? Yeah, well, that's good. We do need to spread the word. Ecu Action is working with the Tax Justice Network in Wellington, and we had one session with them last year, and there are lots of different ways of presenting, of looking at how we can readjust our tax system, and it's really good to know that most New Zealanders see our tax system as being unfair, and that's a really good place to start.
Right.
Yeah. Well, tax avoidance via trusts. Well, I think tax avoidance via trusts is actually very simple to do. It just requires the government to regulate. What often happens, and I'm not being cynical here, but I think that we underestimate the ability of the rich and powerful to lobby to get what they want. And whenever we bring in tax changes, honestly, there are loopholes that are sometimes just built into the system to allow people to get out of it, and trust is one of them. I think there are legitimate reasons for people having trusts, because, and there are, but I think we can, with good government regulation, that's the thing which is missing from here.
John, I think actually not everybody can see everybody else's chat, actually. So we might need to...
shall I read the questions?
Read the questions, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Sorry.
Yep. Thanks, John. Great. How do you propose to get the government to introduce these measures? Well, that's a really good question, and that's where public campaigning comes in. We know the government is very sensitive about these issues, and they tried to introduce a capital gains tax 2 years ago, but they didn't put their heart and soul into it. It was clear that the wealthy and the super wealthy didn't want it. And I'll be really frank with you here. Our Labour government and the national government, they used to run their election campaigns by using cake stalls, just bake some cakes and raise money. Nowadays, no one does a cake stall. They go straight to the corporate sector and look for donations, and you're not going to get a donation to your election campaign if you're going in there arguing for taxes, which taxes on the wealthy. So we have to campaign hard for these things. Very interesting. I've heard the argument that if taxes increased on the wealthy, they'll take their money and disappear overseas. Any comments, please? Yeah, I think again, it's good government regulation which can stop that from happening. I know that I know this is an odd example to use, but back in the days when we were trying to get foreign investment withdrawn from South Africa by New Zealand companies, they said if we withdraw money, we have to have it converted into South African rands, and we lose about 15% of it in the process. I think the government can put in regulations that would make it very difficult for people people could move their money around, but they would have to pay a significant penalty for doing that. I think there are ways around all of these things. Could you describe the difference between a wealth and a capital gains tax? Well, a wealth tax is based on your total wealth. So, and for most people, it's in fact, I shouldn't say that. For people who own their own homes, the biggest wealth you have is the equity in your home. And I should stress, you wouldn't pay the wealth tax on the value of your house, but you'd pay it on the equity you have in your house. So if you've got a $1 million house, if you've got a $2 million house and you've got a $1.5 million mortgage, then you wouldn't pay any tax on it because you don't have any equity in that. You'd only have $500,000 equity, and that wouldn't reach the threshold to pay. So that's like an income tax return once a year. What's your total wealth? Here's what you'd pay in tax. A capital gains tax is something which you would pay at the point of sale of your house, for example, or if you have like your shares increase in value each year. So all the increase in wealth you have, you would pay a capital gains tax on that, whether it's through your increase in the value of your house or your share values or whatever, property values. How does the process take? I'm curious about the process or procedure for this kind of reform. Hang on. Sorry, I'm going back here. Capital acquisition versus capital gain. Why? Capital gain relies on inflation continuing. We don't need that with capital acquisition. We're getting into a lot of detail here. And to be frank, I can't answer all of these questions in the sort of detail you would like. I think what we're doing is putting a broad brush picture out there and saying we need to be pushing in this direction. And there'll be lots of criticisms and lots of ins and outs and lots of people with different ideas, and that's fine. That's all part of a democratic discussion. But we're saying these ideas are ideas that we are pushing out for debate, and we're pushing them in the right direction. And most of the criticisms we've seen, we think can be sort of sorted by government regulation, I suppose. So I'm not sure what the capital gains relying on inflation continuing. Yeah, well, I think what you would do with inflation, you would simply say that the point at which the tax comes on would be inflation adjusted. So if inflation's at 10%, instead of the threshold being $1 million, it would be $1.1 million. So you would change the threshold each year to take account of inflation. I'm curious about the procedure for this type of reform. How does the change take place? A brief step by step. Well, one of the things that we could look at. I mean, the Greens have done this. They put a proposal in, I think in for a private members bill to introduce tax changes, and it failed. But I think we need to get a movement behind tax reform. This proposal or proposals perhaps eventually jointly agreed by a lot of people and put a big push on that. I think that is the way to, we've got to get it in the public arena, get it debated, and then basically in terms of Labour and National, we have to force this on them. We have to force them to do this. As citizens in a democracy, they need to respond in that way. Has there been any engagement with the idea of FTT by main political parties? There hasn't. It's been discussed, and it got very close to being implemented in the European Union about 5 years ago. France and Germany were very keen on a financial transactions tax across all of Europe. And then the wealthy went on the attack over a period of a couple of months, and they absolutely flooded the debate with scaremongering. They had 3 or 4, if you like, attack lines, and they had a massive amount of money, and they had the buy-in from the big newspapers, and they ran this campaign which undermined completely public confidence in a financial transactions tax. And frankly, that same thing would happen here. There will be big money can move a lot of people's opinions using all sorts of misinformation, and that's what they did in Europe. I think it will come back because inevitably it's the kind of tax that's been proposed again and again and again over the years. And I think its time is coming. We're hoping that it might, we are raising this with all the political parties. We're seeking meetings with them to talk about this, so that it's not, so that this is in there, that they know there is an issue here. But ultimately, it's going to take a lot of grassroots campaigning to get there. Could I ask your opinion on the social justice aspect of purely a redistributive taxation model versus addressing the conditions which enable the creation of individual wealth? Social justice aspect of purely redistributive versus addressing the conditions which are... Yeah, well, that's really getting into capitalism being based on that private model of ownership. I think, that's a really big question. I think that the first, if we can get the principle established in people's minds that as citizens of a country, we all have we should have like a charter of citizens' rights, and one of them is a warm, dry home for everyone, which I think is one of the absolutely critical things. And so I think purely redistributive. Yeah, sorry, I'm just talking while I'm thinking about an answer to this. I'm not sure I've got all the answers at all for that. But certainly at the moment, I think one of the things that people believe is that, or we tend to believe, is that what the amount of money a person earns is related to their contribution to society, right? And in reality, the amount of money that a person earns is simply a function of the free market. There was a group in the UK that did a study, the New Economics Foundation, I think it's called, and they showed that in terms of a contribution to society, that a cleaner at a hospital was contributed 13 times more value to the community than a banker did, right? And yet the banker gets vastly more pay than a person working at a hospital. So we're valuing people according to a market when we shouldn't be. We should be valuing people according to their contribution to society. There's that old the old socialist adage, from each according to their ability, to each according to their work. And I think hospital workers are grossly underpaid in that regard. And why don't you recommend land value tax? Easy to administer, and you can't take your land overseas. Well, that's fine. I know that's an idea which is around. It's not one that we particularly considered, but I think it needs to go in the mix. I really do. We're not saying we've got the final answer here, but what we're saying is that these things will the direction we're pushing in is going to make life a whole lot better for people on the lowest incomes, and it's going to mean that there's a better sharing of the cost of running our society. As well, yes, wealth tax paid annually. Yep. No, wealth tax would be. We had the top wealth tax we had was 5%. So every year you'd put a return in for your tax, and what your wealth is above that $1 million, you would pay 5% on that. So year after year, yep, every year you pay your wealth tax. And Deirdre, message from Deirdre. Why don't you recommend land value tax? Yep, I mean, I to be frank, I'm not sure of all the ins and outs of that. And it's not something that I'm aware that the Tax Justice Network have discussed yet, but it is something that should be considered. Would you consider excluding the primary residence from the wealth calculation because there's no income from someone's home? So if my house is just over $1 million, will I have to pay $10,000 a year? No, you won't. If it's over if it's worth over $1 million, you would just pay the tax based on the not on the whole $1 million, but on whatever equity value you have in it above the $1 million. So you pay very little. And I think with the it's set up effectively so that people wouldn't pay a wealth tax based just on the value of their home. For most people, okay, one of the reasons we haven't exempted the family home is that people can hide their wealth in a sense by buying a $20 million home, and then if that's exempt, then that whole $20 million is exempt, and we don't think that would be fair. What happened in the 80s to reduce tax on the rich so much? What happened was that neoliberalism came in, and the tax burden was shifted from the wealthy. The idea was that if you let people become super wealthy, that the wealth will trickle down and everybody will benefit. That's not what happened. That was an absolute joke. That's not what happened. So what the government did, it reduced income tax and then introduced GST. So people on high incomes had massive increases in their income and subsequently in their wealth, while people on low incomes got absolutely hammered. And the situation that I showed on those slides is what it looks like today. And it was Labor that introduced GST. It wasn't National. It was Labor introduced it, and Phil Goff was the Associate Minister of Finance, and he fronted it. And he gave all these justifications for it. And then within a few years, Labor increased it to 12.5%, from 10% to 12.5%, and then National increased it to 15%. What would the formation of citizens' assemblies help in establishing tax reform? Although we probably can't wait that long. I think that's really good, really good, citizens' assemblies. I think that's an idea. I know, for example, one of our mayoral candidates here in Christchurch is raising the whole question of assemblies based around youth, actually. He's talking about getting young people involved in citizens' assemblies to really engage them. And I think that's a really positive thing. But yeah, citizens' assemblies could have a big impact. Overseas, where they're used, they're restricted in the amount of money they're able to recommend for redistribution. But I'm not an expert on this. Some of the people watching this will know far more about it than I do. And someone says, I think the impact of removing GST is being overlooked in the worries about wealth tax. Yeah, well, I think, removing GST. See, I think if you're talking to people on low incomes and you say to them, well, we're going to have a capital acquisitions tax, a financial transactions tax, and a wealth tax, all they will see is that they're going to be taxed more because their financial transactions tax will affect them. I think we have to turn our taxation system on its head. We never used to have a GST. We don't need it now. We simply need to have a much fairer tax system, similar to what we had in as I was growing up. If you own your own home, there is the matter of imputed tax. I'm not sure, don't know anything about that. That's from somebody. I'm sorry, I can't add anything about that. I understand a great deal of the wealth is being held in trusts. Is there some wealth liable to tax? Absolutely. All of these ways that people have of hiding income for tax, all of that is easily doable. It's just called government regulation, but governments, and New Zealand government especially, are very, very aware of regulation. They don't like regulation because regulation is not liked by the tiny number of people who fund them in their election campaigns. And I don't want to sound cynical there, but there is this real, I think our political system's been very much captured by people who donate big donations to political parties to enable them to run these campaigns. Yeah. So that's at the end, I think. Is that the end of the messages so far? Crumbs, I know I've been going.
I think they're coming straight through to you, John. So yeah,
Oh, right.
you'd be seeing who, if there are any others.
Yeah, well, that's the end. That's the last one there.
Wow.
Look, I know. I realise I'm not.
Right.
I'm not the sort of expert who can answer these questions with the detail that people are asking them. But yeah. As I say, this is. I guess it's a work in progress as we work with other organisations and push forward these ideas and Deirdre's idea, the land tax, which has been raised by people like Rath Manji, I think, in the top party, the Opportunities Party, is it? Yeah, the Opportunities Party.
Yeah.
Hang on, there's one other thing here. Someone says, "I'm very glad to know that you are cynical." Well, I guess, yeah. Been around too long well, I mean, all of us here, most of us on this call, we've been around, we've been around and we've seen this transition in our tax in the 1980s, and we've seen the devastating effects on people on low incomes, and we've kind of lived through it, and the people and then people like John Key says, well, you can't tax the wealthy because they're already paying all this high levels of tax. But he only ever talked about income tax. He never talked about GST. They only ever talked about income tax. Yep. I would like to see a couple of the comparative slides between countries again for a bit longer. How do those countries manage it? Look, probably what I should do, I'll send the presentation to Torfrida, and she can circulate it around everyone, or Sally. I'm not sure who does the circulating, but just that can be circulated around everyone. And as I say, we don't have all the answers here, but what we're proposing isn't radical, but we were proposing it in a way that we thought would be seen as a significant, important step. I think a lot more is going to be needed to be done anyway. Which, if any, political party would be the most amenable to introducing a wealth tax? Well, the Green Party does have a wealth tax on their books. It's not as I'm not going to talk for the Green Party. They can talk for themselves, but they have introduced one. Well, they have introduced the idea for one. I think the Māori Party has something similar. It's just National and Labour and ACT, of course, but National and Labour, they're not at the moment interested in any of that. UK having a 40%. I'm not sure what UK. I mean, the UK, the US. I mean, even our top tax. If we just look at income tax for a moment, New Zealand's top income tax rate is 39%, and that's because when Labour came in, they pushed it up to 39%. But that's not as high as the US, the UK, Australia, almost any other country we like to compare ourselves with. They have higher top income tax rates than New Zealand does. We are a very low tax country, and we are wearing it, and our social problems have exploded because of it. Yeah. And I'm just going to make one small comment here about a book called The Spirit Level, and many of you will have read it. I think The Spirit Level was a book written in about 10 years ago by two academics in Britain, whose names escape me for the moment, but if you Google it, you'll find it. And what they found was that in countries, social problems are not associated with poor countries or with rich countries, right? So whether you're a poor country or a rich country in terms of your GST, that is not the determinant of the social problems you face. But what is the determinant of the social problems you face is the level of inequality in your country. So if you have a country where a small number of people are extremely rich and the majority are just struggling or getting by, you have massive social problems. And when I say social problems, I mean everything from health, education, mental health, imprisonment rates, violent crime, even teenage pregnancy. All of these explode when you have massive inequality. So the countries where these problems are a huge issue are in the US, and I mean, they've got all these graphs that look just at the OECD countries using World Bank data. And they find that countries like New Zealand, you know, we have these high levels of social inequality, high levels of income inequality. Therefore, we have high levels of these social problems. Whereas you go down the list to places like Japan and the Nordic countries, where you have much lower inequality, they have much lower levels of these social problems. The sequel, apparently, I didn't know this is a sequel called The Inner Level. No, I haven't seen The Inner Level, but I'll thank you for that. I'll have a look. I'll certainly have a look at that. I'm going to say this also, that the other groups that are pushing for tax change, most of them say that we need, they're very wary about saying we don't need GST because they think that our government is underfunded by about $30 billion a year. We need the extra income to meet all of our social obligations and the investments that we're going to need for climate change. But I think that extra money can be raised again by shifting the tax responsibility on those who are not paying anything like the rates that people on low incomes are paying.
Great. Is that about it? In terms of questions?
Yeah, well, it's all that's come through. I think I might hang on. What do you think is the best way of getting flax roots groups coalesce to be an effective lobby group, if that's what's needed? Yeah, well, I think I mean, I've talked to Frida about this. I think all of us engaged we're all thinking about this really. How can we best push these ideas? And for myself, I think it's as I said at the outset, it's small groups of people working together that can change things. I think a group outside Parliament is desperately needed at the moment, like building a movement outside Parliament rather than trying to build a movement inside. If you build a movement outside Parliament, things change in Parliament anyway. But things won't change in Parliament unless there is a groundswell of movement outside demanding change. Oh, one new message, sorry. It sounds like the goal of these tax reforms is tax fairness to deal with the overshoot problem Hickel addressed. Don't we need taxes to prevent extreme wealth? Absolutely, to prevent extreme wealth accumulation. We absolutely do. We absolutely do. You know, after the when the New Deal came in, after the Depression, the New Deal in the US, they got to the point where they had a proposal for a 100% tax on incomes over, I can't remember what the number was, something like $200,000. So what the US was saying, this is Roosevelt in the New Deal. And in New Zealand, we had a similar thing with the Labour Party in 1935. We didn't call it the New Deal, but we had a similar movement. And around the Western world, there was this, what they called the Great what they call the Great Crunch. So we moved away from inequality to a much flatter, more equal societies from the 1930s to the 80s. But as Piketty told us, that was the exception. Everything else beforehand and since, capitalism has just made the rich richer and the poor poorer. So, you know, if you have a 100% tax, so the government could say, well, you know, we think it's wrong for anybody to be earning over $500,000. So if you're earning over $500,000, we will tax all of that. In other words, there's effectively a cap on the amount. And then there has to be regulation to stop companies from avoiding that tax by giving people cars and giving them holiday homes and giving them whatever. We always have to regulate to prevent people from rorting the system. Capping salaries of CEOs would be marvelous. Would that help inequality? It would absolutely help. And the government should be the one to start. The government should be putting caps on our chief executive salaries and managing them down, which means that whenever a new person is appointed to a senior management position in the public service, they should be on a lower rate of pay than their predecessor. I mean, and public service comes back into it, not just we move away from these corporatized models, stop having our public services mimic the private sector. Let's bring back, and this is one of the things I'm involved in with another group called COA. We're arguing for our water reform. The water reforms are all based on these corporate structures, these corporate water entities, and we're saying no. It should be a public service model of providing water, and people get public service rates of pay. We don't have these flash executive salaries and have the system run by the private sector. And another one, I haven't read, someone's asked me, have I read Thomas Piketty's book on capital and equality? I haven't read that, no. All right, Tilfreda, I feel like I've gas bagged my way too much here.
Well, thanks heaps, John. I mean, we've set up these webinars, largely because we're thinking there needs to be connection between the different groups working on different campaigns like this. And I think you've really kicked it off really well, because I think you've covered a lot of the concerns we have about the whole general structure we're working in, the whole capitalist structure we're working in. And I think we share your concern about the need for a movement of movements, a need to bring the groups together to create a citizens coalition of people wanting those level of that sort of that type of transformational change. I mean, and when you talk about the 1930s, the big sea change, which is when the welfare state was brought in, and it's time, I think, for us to start thinking at that level again. So it's when our Pathways to Survival website, when we did a section on ending inequality, it's like the taxation thing was the driving thing, and the complementary part of that is things like universal basic services, universal basic income, those living wage, those sorts of ways of ensuring income and housing security for people, which could be funded by those sorts of taxation reforms. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, thanks heaps for that, and let's all keep in touch on this. I think.
Can I just say one last thing, which is quite important. I really like what Jason Hickel said. Says in his video. I think it's really, really good. I think, but one of the things we have to remember is that the people, the big capitalists, don't see a problem at all with climate change. They simply say that capitalism will deal with this. It will simply revalue land. It will, land in New Zealand on the east coast will go down in value because it's going to be dry, and it won't be able to, to do as much as land on the west coast, which will be revalued upwards. They don't see a problem. They see that because they're not connected into seeing this from a humanity point of view. And I think we do need to remember that. Yeah. But it was a great video from Jason Hickel. Really, really good.
Yes. I do recommend his books to people. I think we also found him. We wanted to have him, I think, as one of the first first speakers in our webinar series, because he tends to frame the whole issue together,
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, we will be ending. We were doing it. It's about 8:15. Has anybody got any last questions or comments of John or of any of us in terms of the how that went? And we'd love your feedback. We've got a Facebook page which you might have found the event on, but if you looked in Facebook under Pathway to Survival, or if you go to www.pathwaytosurvival.nz, you can find us there, and we'd love your comments on how we're doing this, what we're doing, and how we could do it better. This is our first webinar, and you might have noticed it's we got some glitches and nervousness, but it's really lovely to see you all here. And I think I'll pass to John Tovey to lead us out with a karakia. Oh, let me first mihi, a big mihi to Sally and John Tovey and Anne, and as the backroom people who've kept us all going tonight, which has been wonderful. So thank you very much, and thank you, John. I really appreciate your time for
That's
this.
fine. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Right.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. Thank you, John, Minto, and Tor, and the team. I hope we see you again. I'm going to just repeat the karakia that I started with. I think it's a good one to take away in your minds. Keeping your lights lit, we hope. So that goes. Ka oho te wairua. Ka matara te tinana. E aroha ki te aroha. Ka te rama. Pomari e kaupo.
Mari. Oh, I forgot to say about the upcoming webinars. I'll just say maybe quickly, sorry about that. So we're planning to hold these webinars every fortnight on a Thursday night. The next one is with Catherine Murapainga Aiken. It's looking at why you can't consider climate justice without considering treaty justice and the rights of Indigenous people. And Catherine's got a background in working with the United Nations on Indigenous rights, as well as within Aotearoa. So that's next in a fortnight's time, I think the 18th of August. And then on the 1st, I think it is, of September, we've got Mike Joy talking about Te Taio, the nature, food security, water and land, and why that's important to protect that. So we'd love to see you all there if you'd like to come. So thank you very much, everybody.
Kia ora toa.
Kia ora.